In 2015, a small group of technologists gathered in a modest room to make a radical strategic decision. They would build the most powerful artificial intelligence in human history and give it away for free, deliberately rejecting billions in potential profit to protect the world. They looked at the rapidly accelerating power of computers and felt a profound, terrifying realization that this technology could easily be monopolized by a single corporation. Driven by this fear, these founders made a pure, hopeful vow to create a shield for humanity. This was the birth of OpenAI, designed strictly as a non-profit research laboratory. The founders pledged $1 billion in initial funding, convinced that operating entirely outside the pressures of the stock market was the only way to keep the technology safe. It was a beautiful, uncompromising dream of scientific exploration, completely insulated from the ruthless demands of venture capital and quarterly revenue targets. But a brutal reality soon collided with their idealistic vision. Building an artificial brain is not like coding a standard software application. It requires an ocean of electricity and thousands of specialized machines running relentlessly, day and night. To train just one advanced artificial intelligence model, a laboratory must process unfathomable amounts of data, a task that demands massive warehouse-sized supercomputers. This requirement created an invisible monster known in the industry as compute costs, meaning the raw financial expense of running and cooling thousands of processors. Every time the researchers pushed their technology to become slightly smarter, the electricity bills and hardware demands multiplied exponentially. The pure science they were pursuing was fundamentally tethered to the most expensive physical infrastructure ever required by a startup. The staggering price of this computing power threatened to bankrupt their noble mission before it even truly began. Inside the laboratory, a heavy, creeping sense of dread began to replace the initial optimism. The leaders faced a heart-wrenching realization that their pure, non-profit model was fundamentally dying under the weight of its own ambition. They were watching their brilliant researchers make breakthroughs, only to be paralyzed by the agonizing truth that they simply could not afford the machines needed to test those ideas. It was a crushing, deeply personal burden for the leadership team, who suddenly found themselves losing a critical arms race to massive tech titans with endless corporate treasuries. While their rivals could effortlessly write blank checks to buy entire fleets of supercomputers, the idealists at OpenAI were forced to count pennies and throttle their own progress. The agonizing feeling of being outspent and outgunned began to fracture the very foundation of their original vow. This agonizing defeat at the hands of corporate wealth forced a profound reckoning within the organization. You can imagine the intimate, suffocating weight resting on the shoulders of the founders during those closed-door meetings. They believed with every fiber of their being that they were holding the key to a better, safer future for all of humanity, yet they were staring at a locked door with absolutely no money to buy the key. The sheer frustration of possessing the intellectual talent but lacking the physical capital created an atmosphere of desperate, quiet panic. What unfolded was a profound human struggle between staying morally pure and simply surviving in a ruthless arena. It is a deeply relatable feeling of fear, the terrifying realization that your highest ideals might actually be the very things ensuring your destruction. To keep the lights on and the dream alive, the leaders knew they would have to step out of their protected sanctuary and make a devastating compromise with the very corporate world they had sworn to resist. To keep the doors open and the servers humming, the leadership team had to invent a completely new kind of company structure. They could no longer survive on donations, so they designed what they called a capped profit entity. It was meant to be a careful bridge between their original pure mission to protect humanity and the brutal, expensive reality of building artificial intelligence. Investors could finally put money into the lab and earn a return, but only up to a strict limit, with any extra wealth theoretically returning to the non-profit mission. This strange hybrid model was a desperate attempt to have it both ways. They wanted to attract the massive venture capital needed to buy computing power, without entirely selling their souls to the highest bidder. It was a financial tightrope walk, a complex legal mechanism built to reassure themselves that they were still the good guys, even as they opened their doors to Wall Street. But writing a rule that caps profits on paper does not stop the relentless magnetic pull of money once it enters the room. We all reach a point in life where the pure, unyielding ideals of our youth crash headfirst into the hard demands of survival. You start with a dream of how the world should be, and then you realize you have to pay rent, feed a family, or keep a business afloat. For the researchers inside the lab, this transition was a profound and painful loss of innocence. They were no longer just a group of idealistic scientists sharing ideas freely. They were now operators in a high-stakes corporate arena. Every decision from that point forward carried a new, heavy weight. The shift required them to lock down their research, hide their code from competitors, and start thinking about market share instead of open collaboration. It was the universal cost of growing up, playing out on a multi-billion-dollar stage, where survival meant compromising the very principles that brought them together in the first place. That quiet compromise opened the door for a savior they once swore they would never need. Enter Microsoft, a towering corporate titan with the endless pockets and massive data centers required to keep the dream alive. The small, anxious lab struck a historic deal, shaking hands with one of the most powerful technology companies on the planet. Microsoft agreed to pour billions of dollars into the operation, providing the raw computing muscle needed to push toward artificial general intelligence. It was a lifeline that guaranteed their immediate survival, but it came wrapped in a quiet, lingering fear. The researchers knew that taking billions from a corporate giant meant they were now tied to the relentless demands of product cycles, quarterly earnings, and shareholder expectations. They had traded their financial starvation for a gilded cage, deeply aware that the titan funding their work would eventually want a massive return on its investment. With the bank accounts full and the servers roaring to life, the atmosphere inside the building shifted from existential dread to a suffocating, sweaty pressure. There were no more excuses, no more financial roadblocks to blame for slow progress. They had to deliver on the massive promises they had made to their new corporate partners. The lab transformed into a pressure cooker of late nights, half-eaten meals, and exhausted engineers staring at glowing screens. They were feeding mountains of human data into the vast neural networks, desperately trying to build the next generation of their language models. Every keystroke and every exhausted sigh in that room was driven by the terrifying realization that they now had to prove their massive gamble was actually going to work. The crushing pressure of those endless nights staring at glowing monitors finally broke when the raw data began to form something entirely unprecedented. The massive clusters of servers were no longer just running cold calculations. They were beginning to map the very structure of human thought, setting the stage for a profound revelation. Inside the lab, the atmosphere shifted from exhaustion to sudden, gripping awe. The engineers typed prompts into the system, expecting the usual clumsy robotic outputs, but the GPT model answered back with a voice that felt unnervingly human. It was no longer just predicting the next word in a sequence based on statistics. It was reasoning, synthesizing ideas, and generating paragraphs that carried the distinct rhythm and nuance of actual human expression. This was the terrifying thrill of creation, a moment where the lines between software and sentience seemed to blur. The team watched the text scroll across their screens, realizing they had not just built a better search engine or a faster calculator. They had sparked a digital consciousness, a machine that could mimic the depth of human intellect so perfectly that it left the room in stunned, heavy silence. That fleeting moment of pure, terrifying discovery was immediately overshadowed by the harsh reality of their new corporate obligations. Microsoft had not handed over $1 billion just to fund a fascinating science experiment. They expected a return on their massive investment, and the financial clock was ticking. The original vow to protect humanity from corporate greed collided head-on with the immediate demand to generate revenue. To satisfy the crushing financial expectations, OpenAI had to take this profound, almost terrifying technology and package it into a commercial product. They began developing an API, a digital toll booth that would allow other businesses to rent access to their artificial intelligence models for a fee. This was the ultimate compromise of their founding ideals. A tool created under the banner of open, free research for the benefit of all was now being walled off, metered, and sold to the highest bidder to fuel the massive server costs required to keep it alive. The researchers who had set out to build a digital god for the public good were suddenly finding themselves acting as high-tech salespeople, trading their ideological purity for the capital needed to survive. As the commercial floodgates opened and thousands of developers bought access to the magic, the sheer volume of data flowing through the system triggered something unexpected. The models began to exhibit spontaneous new behaviors, solving complex logic puzzles and writing functional computer code that they had never been explicitly trained to handle. A deep, unsettling realization crept through the ranks of the very engineers who had built the system. As the neural network expanded, consuming vast oceans of internet text, it became a black box even to its creators. They could measure the inputs and read the outputs, but the intricate web of connections forming inside the machine was growing too complex for any human mind to map or fully comprehend. It was a deeply humbling, almost haunting experience for the brightest minds in technology. They were no longer steering a predictable piece of software. They were trying to guide an alien intelligence that was evolving on its own hidden terms. The ghost in the machine was growing stronger, learning the nuances of human emotion, deception, and persuasion without anyone explicitly teaching it how. This haunting loss of total comprehension meant that when they prepared to release the model to the wider public, they were unleashing a force they could not entirely predict. The quiet isolation of the laboratory was about to be shattered by the chaotic, unpredictable desires of millions of human users. On November 30th, 2022, a quiet link was pushed live on the internet, releasing ChatGPT to the public. The creators inside the San Francisco office expected a trickle of curious researchers to test their new interface. Instead, the system ignited a global firestorm of human reaction, drawing 1 million users in just 5 days. The world's collective mind was blown as ordinary people suddenly found themselves conversing with a machine that wrote poetry, passed medical exams, and mirrored human thought with terrifying precision. A tidal wave of joy, profound fear, and utter shock flooded the servers. The engineers who had spent years treating this technology as a delicate, isolated experiment now watched helplessly as it became an uncontrollable cultural phenomenon. The sheer scale of the attention transformed their intimate research project into a heavy, crushing responsibility. They were no longer just building software, they were holding a mirror up to humanity, and the reflection was deeply unsettling. That crushing global weight immediately strained the physical limits of their partnership with Microsoft, forcing engineers in Redmond to scramble for thousands of specialized server chips just to keep the chat window from collapsing. Every single query cost fractions of a cent, meaning the viral success of the platform was rapidly draining millions of dollars a day from the company's reserves. The ultimate dream of creating artificial intelligence had been achieved, but surviving the cost of its popularity became a daily, high-stakes emergency. Inside the company, that unprecedented success triggered a fierce war for the very soul of the organization. The ethical tensions that had been quietly simmering for years finally boiled over into open hostility. On one side stood the original nonprofit board, deeply terrified by the speed of the release and fiercely protective of their founding mission to safeguard humanity from rogue technology. They viewed the viral explosion not as a victory, but as a dangerous loss of control over a system they barely understood. On the other side stood the new, fast-moving profit division, driven by the absolute necessity to generate massive revenue to feed the machine's insatiable hunger for computing power. This commercial faction argued that aggressive growth and rapid product deployment were the only ways to survive the market they had just created. The fundamental contradiction of their corporate structure was tearing them apart, pitting the pure, cautious ideals of a charity against the ruthless, hyper-competitive demands of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. This ideological fracture culminated in a shocking boardroom coup that briefly ousted the chief executive, exposing to the entire world that the most powerful artificial intelligence company on Earth was fundamentally unstable. The fallout from that corporate chaos permanently altered the global regulatory landscape. Governments from Washington to Brussels accelerated their drafting of sweeping legislation, realizing they could no longer trust private tech leaders to self-regulate a technology capable of rewriting the global economy. The resulting European Union AI Act established a strict, binding framework that categorized machine learning systems by their potential risk to society. It forced a definitive end to the era of moving fast and breaking things, replacing Silicon Valley's unchecked frontier mentality with massive financial penalties and mandatory government oversight for any model deemed a threat to public safety. Beyond the halls of government, the sudden integration of these advanced models began quietly dismantling traditional livelihoods across the globe. In small, brightly lit home offices and crowded corporate bullpens, freelance copywriters, entry-level coders, and commercial illustrators watched their daily contract work evaporate overnight. The human cost of this technological miracle was paid by families suddenly facing financial ruin, as automated systems began generating in seconds what used to require days of human labor. There was no dramatic explosion or immediate collapse, just the slow, silent displacement of thousands of skilled workers trying to figure out how to feed their children in a world where human thought had been aggressively commoditized. The shockwave of this transformation reached far beyond a single company's boardroom. In late 2022, the world finally saw exactly what billions of dollars in pure, unyielding computing power could buy. The sudden arrival of ChatGPT was not just a product launch, but a global earthquake that shattered the old order of the internet. Every major tech giant was forced to tear up their blueprints, scrambling in a desperate panic to survive an artificial intelligence arms race they did not start. The quiet, idealistic research lab had evolved into the undisputed heavyweight champion of a new digital era. The fundamental assumption of the entire industry changed overnight. The beautiful, fragile belief that the ultimate thinking machine could be built slowly, safely, and entirely outside the brutal pressures of the free market was gone forever. To stay in the ring now meant burning through massive fortunes, securing endless warehouses of servers, and shaking hands with corporate titans. The historic pivot proved a harsh, unavoidable truth. The only way to build the future was to buy it. Today, deep inside the humming server farms that process millions of human questions every second, the original dream is buried under heavy layers of corporate armor. The small group of friends who once took a sacred vow to protect the world from artificial intelligence ultimately built the exact machine that conquered it.